Well, I don't know about you. Do you have any mentors, people in your field that you just think highly of? People that when they say something, you listen to them, or maybe they write something and you read it. I don't know if you have those people, but I have people in my life. Over the decades, I've had theologians and so forth. There's one gentleman who you hear me talk about a lot, and that's John Ortberg. John Ortberg finished his Master's of Divinity. Now, here's how a Master's of Divinity works. If you want to get ordained, if you're a medical student, just because you go through med school doesn't mean you're a doctor. You still have to go through the board. Same thing with law. Same thing is true in most places of seminary. You get a Master's of Divinity, that doesn't mean you're ordained. Now you're prepared to go through 2 or 3 years of examination, psychological evaluations, etc. And so he is ordained as a pastor, but he also has his PhD in clinical psychology. So while he was working on his degree in clinical psychology, he was pastoring at a small church. Actually, it was a large church. And the pastor asked him if he would preach. Now, here's something people don't know about John Ortberg, is he has strong anxiety issues. It's gotten better. But when he got started, he had strong anxiety issues. So the first time he got up to preach, he was preaching and he fainted. So he went back to his seminary. He went to the clinical psychology department, talked to the dean of students. Arch Hart was the man's name, who happened to be a specialist on tools to eliminate stress in your life. And so he said, you got to help me. So he got all these kinds of tools and so forth. And then a couple months later, he was invited to preach again. He gets up using all of his tools, and he faints. He looks at the pastor and says, I don't think I should preach anymore. And the pastor says, you're called to be a pastor, and that means to help preach. So we'll do it again. Besides that, when you preach, the attendance goes up because people want to see if you're going to faint or not. They kind of have bets. Are you going to make it through it or not? So he went and he preached, and again he fainted a third time. So he went back to Arch Hart, the dean. He said, I went back to Arch and said, this is not good. I can't preach if I faint regularly. It makes people nervous. And the more scared of fainting I am, the worse my preaching gets. And the worse my preaching gets, the more scared I get. Give me more stress reduction exercises. I want to guarantee that this won't happen again. I will try harder not to faint. And Arch said, that's not a good plan. Because it turns out that if you have fainting or anxiety problems, trying really hard not to faint or have anxiety actually makes you more likely to faint. He said, here's an idea. Next time you preach, just set a chair out on the platform. Then when you're about to faint, sit down. It's much harder to faint when you're sitting down. Plus, you don't have so far to fall. But it would be humiliating, I said. People keep telling me, just trust God, to have more faith. This would be a public reminder of my weakness. And Arch said, exactly. So in my early days of preaching, I preached standing next to an empty chair. And when things didn't go well, I would sit down. Well, I don't have an anxiety issue, but I do have an empty chair issue. I have a bad back. It's frustrating and at times even embarrassing and humiliating. Because you see, I was the weightlifter. I was the strong guy. I was the guy that if somebody fell, they would call me and I would come help get the elderly back in bed. Downtown, before we had Hank, I was the first in the office and the last to leave the building. And if we ever had a gathering, I was the one helping put chairs together and tables together. I was always the one people called. And now, I can't even bring this chair out here by myself. I have to have people help me. I know what it's like to have your weakness shown. In the Gospel of Luke, on another Sabbath, Jesus, to the synagogue and was teaching, and a man was there whose right hand was shriveled. The Pharisees and the teachers of the law were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, so they watched him closely to see if he had healed on the Sabbath. But Jesus knew what they were thinking, and he said to the man with the shriveled hand, "Get up and stand in front of everyone." So he got up and he stood there. And then Jesus said to them, "I ask you, which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save life or to destroy it?" He looked around at them all, and then he said to them, "Stretch out your hand," he said to the man, and the man did so. And his hand was completely restored. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law were furious, and they began to discuss with one another what they might do to Jesus. So one final Ortberg thought. Decades ago, he and another pastor friend named Paul went to Ethiopia. Ethiopia at that time was run by a Marxist regime that did not like Christians, persecuted, murdered, and killed Christians. In fact, they got there, they smuggled Bibles in, they met with people from the underground house churches that were pastors, and they were in the shadow of a prison that they called the university because that's where you were sent to be taught a lesson. Lessons for the Marxist regime of persecution and torture. Lessons for the Christians to grow deeper in your faith and to hold on to Jesus. And so Paul talked about this text, and he reminded them, in those days, they make it clear that it was the right hand, the dominant hand. This would be a hand the man would try to hide because it was embarrassment, it was weakness. And in those days, if you had a malady, people would look at you and say, "Who sinned, you or your family? Because somebody sinned, God is punishing you." And Jesus asked this man to stand up in front of all the religious leaders, in front of everybody, and says, "Show him your hand." Are you kidding me? I've been trying my whole life not to let anybody see my weakness. But he shows them the hand. And it's restored. It's healed. And Paul says, as followers of Jesus, you need to know every single person has a weakness. Everybody has an issue, no matter how much they look like they have it together on the outside, inside, everybody has a weakness. So the invitation is to join the fellowship of the withered hand. Because we all have withered hands, emotionally, spiritually, physically. The Spirit of God moved. One young man just got up and said to the people, to other pastors, "I have a confession. I know we're supposed to be excited about going to the university. We wear it like a badge of honor. I'm scared. I don't want to go to the university. I don't want to be tortured. I don't want to be beaten." Another man got up and walked across the room, and he went to another pastor and got on his knees in front of him and said, "I just need you to forgive me because you're reaching more people for Jesus than I am, and my ego thinks it's a competition. And so I think bad things about you sometimes. I try to, rather than work myself up, I try to bring you down." And another pastor walked over to somebody and said, "I need forgiveness. I'm jealous of how you can get money to do things, and I can't." The fellowship of the withered hand. We're in a series called Pilgrimage, the Psalms of Ascent, Psalm 120 to 134, that 3 times a year, the Hebrew people all across the land, not just in Israel, but wherever they may be, Egypt or wherever, they would take a pilgrimage up to Jerusalem to be in the center of God. And in Psalm 120, we saw that when the psalmist is going, he reminds himself that it's good to go there because even though he knows intellectually who God is, his life doesn't always reflect it, and he drifts. In Psalm 121, we saw that as they go, they look up to the mountains. Where does their help come from? And they look for Elohim, the one who's the creator. Yahweh Elohim. Yahweh is Elohim. And they're looking, but they see all the false prophets. They see the Asherin pole. And they see the Baal altars. And they realize that we live in a world full of false gods, and we have to move around them to find their one true God. It takes intentionality on our part to follow Jesus. And then we get to Psalm 122, and I love this psalm. When they said, "Let's go to the house of Yahweh, the Lord," my heart leapt for joy. Let me ask you a question. How many of you woke up this morning and you were excited about coming to church? How many of you actually said to yourself, "Last night we can't be out too late because remember we have church in the morning"? Eugene Peterson says, one of the afflictions of pastoral work has been to listen with a straight face to all the reasons people give for not going to church. My mother made me when I was little. Or there are too many hypocrites in church. And what do we say to that? That's okay, come on in. There's room for one more. It's the only day I have to sleep in. There was a time when I responded to such statements with simple arguments that exposed them as flimsy excuses. Then I noticed that it didn't make any difference. If I showed the inadequacy of one excuse, 3 more would pop up in its place. So I don't respond anymore. I listen, I go home, and I pray for that person that they will one day find the one sufficient reason for going to church, which is God. So why? Why were they so excited about going to the house of the Lord? When they said, let's go to the house of Yahweh, my heart leapt for joy, and now we're here, O Jerusalem, inside Jerusalem walls. Jerusalem is built like a city that is closely compacted together. Now, this Hebrew word for compacted, it's used throughout the Old Testament. This is the only time it's not used for a relationship between 2 parties. A man to man, man and wife, relationships, tribe against tribe, and it's always about unity. It's about having peace with God so that we can have peace with each other. So scholars say what happens here is you have the psalmist walking through Jerusalem, noticing how close the walls are together, and he says, this is why we come to Jerusalem, to worship God and to be reminded we're supposed to be living in unity one with another. James May says Jerusalem's a place of praise. Thus their unity, coming together as people, was required by the law. Why? Because God knows us. He knows that our personalities are to go ahead and to isolate ourselves and then become the own God of our own little kingdom. The requirement for coming together to praise God was meant to unify and give common vision and unity, which assisted in living in peace, peace with God and peace with others. They are refreshed through the worship. They are taught, reminded once again that they are God's people, and they should do what? Act like it. We get to represent God to a hurting world. Act like it. Psychologists tell us that in our lifespan, we function a lot like a bird. A bird does 3 things. It nests, and then it broods. It takes care, it teaches and learns and rests with its children, and then it ventures out. Scholars say that the world functions like a pendulum, going from left to right, left to right. Pretty much every 20 to 25 years, you can almost guarantee politically there's going to be a shift from left to right, and all places in between. They said if you track it and document, it's pretty much like clockwork. We all do the same things. They say in our lives, this nesting and this venturing, about every 7 years. Hence the term the 7-year itch came from this studies. And so you have this going back and forth. Now, if you're going back and forth and you're in a relationship, maybe you're in sync with your family or spouse, or maybe you're not in sync. Certainly, if we're not in sync as a family, you take a church like Faithbridge, it's very eclectic. It's hard to get everybody in sync. So let me give you an example. Let's say that my wife and I own a cabin by the lake. We don't, but let's say we own a nice cabin, and the kids are out of the house. And so I say to Karen, this summer, let's go invest in that cabin. Let's get it fixed up really nice so you and I have a little getaway. And once a week in the summertime, we'll ask all the kids to come back and we'll have lake week, and that'll be wonderful. And she looks at me and says, well, you're nesting. I was actually thinking it might be nice to sell that old cabin. And maybe since the kids are gone, you and I'll go on adventures together by ourselves, and we'll travel all around the world because she's venturing. Nesting and venturing. We all do it. Scott Peck, in his book, A Road Less Traveled, says, if you're going to climb a mountain, you need a good base camp, nesting. He says it's not either or, it's both and, it's happening all the time. A place equipped with provisions, a place for sharing instructions, telling stories, the brooding, the resting, the preparing, and a place where you can take nourishment and rest before seeking summits, before you go out and you venture. So Richard Foster wrote a book many years ago called Streams of Living Water, celebrating the great traditions of the Christian faith. Here's what he says. He says, if you look at historically, there are 6 streams that go in the Christian faith. We're not talking about Muslims. We're not talking about Buddhism. We're talking about Christianity. Any one of those streams will lead you to Jesus. They're all good streams. One's not better than the other. They're just different. There's 6 main streams, and all of you were formed spiritually by one of those streams. So here's the thing about Faithbridge. Because we're so eclectic, we have Roman Catholics, we have Lutherans, we have Baptists, we have Pentecostals, we have Charismatics, we even have some Methodists. We've got unchurched, and all of you bring your different streams of how you think church should be done with you. And I get to pastor all of these streams. And it's sometimes like herding cats, because here's the good news about us is the Methodist movement has breadth and depth. So we touch on all of the streams. The problem is when I'm touching on one stream, your rhythm may be looking for this stream, and you usually let me know it. So let me give you an example. One of the streams is a contemplative stream. They might describe their relationship with God of turn of romance. Now, the caution is they're so heavenly minded, they're no earthly good. These are the folks that say, I don't need to go to church. I'm going to go fishing. My spirituality is when I'm sitting there in the midst of God's creation and I'm fishing and I just reflect and think upon God. And God says, that's great, but I didn't create you to be by yourself. You're created to be in community, so you need to get to church. Because when you're in the different streams, they'll stretch you when you're sitting next to somebody. So we had a sweet saint. And when she would come to church, and this still happens in the first service, when she would come to church and sit down, she wanted to sit there quietly, no one talk, and just quietly reflect, get herself centered so she's ready for worship. The problem is there's a lot of talk. That first service, no offense, they're smaller in numbers, but their energy is fierce. Because some of those people don't get out of the house very often. They're just happy to see other people. Maybe they're widowed, maybe they're older. And they love to chat. And so she said she would sit there and she would shush people. I don't know how many times I had to walk up and say, you can't shush people. And so she was sitting there one day, and I walked by, and she had a little smirk on her face, and I said, everything okay? And she said, yes. She goes, do you want to know why I'm smiling? I said, sure. She goes, I'm not shushing anybody. I said, well, thank you, Grandma Jean. I appreciate that. I said, what's going on? And she said, I was sitting there, and I wanted to get centered. I looked over, and some laughter had erupted, and I was about to shush them, and when I looked over, I realized it was a friend I know. And she was going through something so difficult. I hadn't seen her smile in a long time, and there she's laughing. And so I sat there and thought to myself, maybe that's the only reason she needed to come to church, is to have that conversation. You know what? I'm mature enough to sit here and just focus and center myself and let God speak to them in other ways. Some of you come from an evangelical tradition, discovering the word-centered life focused on people making a decision for Jesus Christ. This is part of our heritage. And when you forget this, you preach about Jesus, but you never ask for the sale. So some of you, no matter who's preaching, but let's just pick on me. Let's say I'm preaching, it's pretty orthodox, and there's good teaching material in there for you to take and to think about and apply to your life. You'll come up to me afterwards and you'll say, yeah, why didn't you give an altar call? And I'm like, did you miss that? Is that all you took away? Didn't you hear anything? Not really. Where's the altar call? Because that's the stream you grew up with. I could get up here and read the phone book and afterwards do an altar call just like you grew up, and you'd come up and say, that was a good service today. Because there was an altar call. But you got to be careful, because otherwise you get a narrow view of what the Christian life looks like. And you can only get saved or born again so often. Some of you come from a charismatic tradition, the Spirit-empowered life, and you're looking to see how many people are raising their hands during worship to decide whether it's really a good worship set. Or you come up to me afterwards and say, goosebumps, God was moving. And I'm like, or you just need to put a sweater on. For you want us to go for about a half hour to 45 minutes of worship, and then 45 minutes we should have 2-hour worship service, and at the end of every service, I shouldn't bring out just a little vial of oil to anoint people, bring out tubs and let's get messy. And I grew up in part of that. When Karen and I were at Oral Roberts University, one of my roommate, was a guy who was the pianist for a famous, internationally famous missionary, T.L. and Daisy Osborne. In the Pentecostal world, they're very well known. And he would also play piano at times at chapel. And so one time we were having a smaller chapel, maybe 100, 150 people. They brought in a guest speaker, and he was moving in the Spirit. Some of you will know this. Some of this will sound weird to you. But he was prophesying, giving words of knowledge, and people were coming up, and he was praying for them. They were falling in the Spirit. And I looked over at my friend Kurt, who was playing the piano, and tears were just streaming down his face. And I looked at Karen, and I said, the Spirit's moving, man. Look at Kurt. She goes, yeah. So we go up afterwards, and I said, Kurt, that was pretty powerful. You were playing underneath, the Spirit moving, and he turned and his eye was all red. And he said, there's something in my contact. I could not wait for that guy to get done. The caution is if you focus so much on feelings, many people would bounce from church to church looking for the next spiritual experience. You don't have to. God is moving everywhere if you'll just put up your antennas. Sometimes it's easier to see, sometimes it's not. And you Roman Catholic people, you're still trying to figure out what I'm doing up here. Because you sit there and look at me and say, I kind of like the guy, but honestly, our last church, that priest could do a homily and the Eucharist every week in 25 minutes. What's going on? We come from different streams. We're part of the holiness tradition, the social justice tradition. We have all of these streams. It's good to wake up and it's good to come to the Lord, to remind yourself that you're praising God. And all of the tribes, all 12 nations were expected to show up. And we come together in our different streams knowing that some people worship a little different than us, but that's okay. We all love Jesus. We're going the same direction. And we're stretched by each other. And we begin to realize God speaks to me more than just my little stream. I can actually dip over here. I like this. It's a good experience. That is where the tribes go up, the tribes of Yahweh, the 12 tribes of Israel, to praise the name of Yahweh according to the statute of Israel, according to the fact the law tells them they were supposed to do it 3 times a year. And then there are thrones for judgment. And they stand the thrones in the house of David. James made pilgrimage was a time when unresolved conflicts were brought before the judges. Pilgrimages included a journey in search of justice. So the judges would sit on the mercy seat of Moses, and they would hear the complaints, and they would make a judgment. You're wrong, you're right. You need to reconcile. So when you went to church, it was to go and to ask for forgiveness from somebody that you might have offended or give forgiveness. But most of the time for us, it's just to come and say, Lord, search my heart. We talked about this last week. Paul Tournier, there's this axis of I'm not guilty and I am guilty. I feel guilty and I don't feel guilty. And sometimes you feel like neurosis. So this last Thursday night, I drove to the Dells, spent the night, got up from 7 o'clock in the morning till 6 o'clock at night. We were interviewing candidates that think they want to go into the ministry. Part of our job was to be the gatekeepers. There's pressure in that. How do you tell somebody you may feel called, but pastoral ministry is not for you? They would write 25 to 30-page essays. We would read them, and then we would interview them. I guarantee you, each one of them left thinking to themselves, did I say the right thing? Did I come across the right way? I know because I did. After everyone left, I thought, was I too harsh? Was I just right? Did I give good criticism? And then if I'm not guilty and I don't feel guilty, I have peace. But this is the one I love. I feel guilty and I am guilty. And that's conviction for one of 2 reasons. Number one, I did something that I knew I shouldn't do. I said something I knew I shouldn't say, and God gave me that check. So I need to go ask for repentance, or I need to at least ask for forgiveness with God. But oftentimes, it's God looking at you and saying, I'm a holy God, and you're supposed to be my hands and feet, so I expect more from you. So it's more than just giving your life to Jesus and holding on to a ticket to get to heaven. Now I need you to be my hands and feet on this earth, so I need you to change some of your habits, some of your rhythms, some of your beliefs, some of your statements. I need to change and transform you more and more into my image. And so you'll get a conviction that God's trying to change me. But this one is the one that concerns us, right? I am guilty, but I don't feel guilty. And that's one of the reasons you come to church. That's one of the reasons you join a small group. That's one of the reasons you build spiritual friendships. So that when you're out and about and somebody comes up to you and speaks truth to you, but does it in love, and it resonates in your spirit, that maybe there's some weak spots. You're willing to say, I need to pray about that. Thank you for bringing it to my attention. It's good to come into the house of the Lord, to worship God, to have our hearts examined, to build relationships, and to be stretched by the different streams. Now, I don't know how many of you know this. Did you know that a lot of the fast food places, rather than taking the deposit at the end of the day and handing it to somebody who then is going to take it to the bank, which is very routine and very easy to be robbed, throughout the day we'll have someone go through the drive-thru and they'll hand them what looks like a bag of food, but it's a deposit. And then they'll drive and deposit. Nobody knows. So in San Diego a few years ago, there was a man in a convertible with a beautiful young lady next to him. And he pulled up, and they were going to go to the lake and or the beach and have a picnic, and he wanted a bucket of chicken. And they gave him the wrong bag. So he drove away, and they got a few miles down the road and checked out the chicken, and they had a bucket of money. So they went back, and they went to the drive-thru, and the guy says, I think we got the wrong bucket. And the manager said, oh, thank goodness. He took it and he counted all the money and it was all there. And he goes, before you leave, will you do me a favor? Do you mind if I call the newspaper? I would love to call the newspaper. I would love to call the radio station. We live in a world that is so divided and so yucky. Wouldn't it be nice to have a story like yours of integrity? Do you mind if we do that? And the man said, yes, I mind. Don't do that. 2 reasons. First of all, I just want a bucket of chicken. And second of all, this lovely lady is not my wife. You see, we all have this outward appearance that we have our act together and we're full of integrity, that we're not a mess. But everybody is part of the fellowship of the withered hand. Everybody is. So here's my request of you this week, because I know last week you all kept your little thing right in front of the shower or bathtub, so thank you for that. Don't say anything. Let me just believe that. But would you agree with me that no fellowship, no church of believers is perfect? Would you agree with that? But what are a few things that you appreciate about Faithbridge? So do you know we have a woman in our church, Maureen Wolf. She comes to church I think it's Thursdays or Tuesdays. I think it's Thursdays. Thursday? Wednesday. She comes once a week. And most times she's by herself. Sometimes Joy is with her. And she goes in and she puts on worship music and she prays for this church. She prays for you every week. So we've asked her, now she gives us a list. So if you get the newsletter, it comes electronically. Open it up, and if you scroll down, you'll see prayer for every day of the week, things you can pray for this church. If you don't get the newsletter, it's because we don't have your information. So take that little card in the chair, fill it out so that we can make sure we send you, but you got to give us your email address, so we can make sure we send you the information. So the first thing I'm asking, will you commit for at least 1 week to pray for this church? Would you do that? And it's right there. I'll tell you one thing I need prayer. I am scouring the earth trying to find Pastor Dave, somebody who will come on staff and fill that role. I need prayer. All right? Second, who are some people you look forward to seeing each time you come, and why? What is it about them? And then ask God to search your heart and say, Lord, do I have an attractive spirit, or do I come across grumpy? Do I come across too much trying to manipulate people? Ask God to search your heart. And the final thing may be the biggest struggle for some of you, but here it goes. I asked that they have donuts, and they ordered 20 dozen donuts. So there's 20 dozen donuts sitting in the fellowship hall, the gathering place. I'm going to ask that you suffer for Jesus and that you go and you have some coffee and you have a donut. Now, you know the coffee and donut are just vehicles to have fellowship. Find somebody who maybe looks a little different. Maybe they dip their toe in a different stream than you. Be willing to have even if you just go in there, great, I'm on a diet. I don't care. Get in there and have a cup of coffee. Get a glass of water. Just be present. That's the point we're making. The Bucks aren't playing right now. The Packers aren't playing. The Brewers aren't playing. Nobody's playing right away. So suffer for Jesus and go have a donut. So I'm going to ask the worship team to get in place. We're going to sing our closing song. And then I'm going to ask for you just to go have a donut. Have a cup of coffee. Have a glass of water. At least look at somebody for 5 seconds and go, sup. That's all I'm asking. Just connect.